He was born into silk, raised among golden mirrors, and addressed as Your Highness before he could read his own name. But just a few years later, he was whispering to rats in a dark, rotting prison, calling out for a mother who had already been beheaded. This is not a tale from fiction. This is the story of a real child, Louis Charles, the son of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI, the boy who, at just 9 years old, was declared King of France by royalists, and then disappeared into silence. They crowned him in name, but never in power. They took away his family, his identity, even his clothes. Guards beat him until he no longer spoke. Revolutionaries paraded his innocence through public trials like a trophy of their new justice. In that tiny cell, his crown became a curse. No one came to save him. No one dared. When he died, they said he was 10. But in truth, the boy known as Louis XVII had been dying since the moment the world declared him king. What happened to the most tragic child king in history? And why, centuries later, do some still believe he might have escaped? This is the story of a child imprisoned by a revolution, forgotten by his kingdom and remembered only by a heart that refused to stop beating, even after death. In 1785, France was a nation draped in golden splendor and built on fragile foundations. Behind the marble halls of Versailles and the shimmering gowns of the aristocracy, a storm had already begun to gather. Unseen and unheeded by the nobles who danced in candlelight, a different fire burned in the streets. Bread was scarce, taxes were unbearable, and the people, though still silent, were beginning to seethe. Into this world a child was born. Louis Charles, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, came into the world on March 27, 1785, in the Palace of Versailles. The cries of his birth echoed through mirrored halls as courtiers bowed, nobles wept with joy, and gun salutes rang through the gardens. He was not just a baby. He was a symbol of continuity, of divine right, of Bourbon destiny. To the royal family, he was the spare, the backup heir in case tragedy befell his older brother. But to the nation, he was hope, wrapped in lace and laid in gold. The people still remembered the Dauphin who had come before, his brother Louis Joseph, a delicate child already showing signs of sickness. As Louis Charles grew, so too did whispers in the palace corridors. Would he live long enough to carry the crown? Louis Charles was an affectionate, intelligent boy. Even at a young age, he showed a remarkable sense of perception. He mimicked voices, memorized lines of poetry, and rode horses with quiet focus. His tutors praised his charm, his curiosity. He was a child loved not only by his parents, but by the entire royal court. But love in Versailles was a dangerous thing, especially when it blinded you to the world beyond the palace gates. By the late 1780s, France was already collapsing beneath the weight of its own grandeur. The treasury was nearly empty, drained by foreign wars, lavish spending, and a rigid social order that taxed the poor while shielding the rich. The Enlightenment had planted seeds of rebellion in the minds of the educated classes, and the American Revolution had offered a model of defiance. The nobles refused to pay taxes. The peasants had nothing left to give, and the king simply waited. Paralyzed by tradition, surrounded by flatterers, he failed to act. Inside Versailles, little Louis Charles played with mechanical toys made by the finest craftsmen in Europe. He wore shoes stitched with gold thread and silk robes heavier than his own tiny frame. Servants bowed at every doorway. Etiquette governed even his playtime. Outside Versailles, children his age were digging through trash heaps for food. Whole families sold their furniture for flour. The monarchy, once seen as sacred, now appeared grotesque. And the queen, Marie Antoinette, became a symbol of that grotesquerie, lavish, foreign, and famously indifferent. "Let them eat cake," she was rumored to have said. She never actually said it, but in the court of public opinion, truth had already given way to rage. In 1789, everything broke. The Estates General was convened in a last-ditch attempt to salvage royal authority, but it only poured oil on fire. The Third Estate, the voice of the common people, rose up, declared itself the National Assembly, and began to rewrite the future of France. Within weeks, the Bastille fell. From the windows of Versailles, the royal family could see the smoke rising. Louis Charles, barely 4 years old, likely didn't understand the meaning of the noise. But his nurses did. His mother did. And his father, the king, began to realize too late what was coming. Versailles became a gilded cage. Guards doubled. Rumors spread through the halls about assassins, uprisings, plots. Servants vanished in the night. Nobles fled to Austria and Prussia. And in the midst of it all, the little boy still played with toy drums, unaware that he would soon be surrounded by real ones. By 1790, France had become a country at war with itself. The revolutionaries in Paris demanded constitutional reform. The king hesitated. The people pushed harder, and those close to the court began to talk of escape. The royal family's attempted flight to Varennes in 1791 was a catastrophic failure. Dressed in disguise, they boarded a carriage and made their way toward the border under cover of night. Louis Charles, now 6 years old, rode quietly beside his sister, unaware that the fate of the monarchy rested on their shoulders. They were captured just miles from safety. When the royal family was marched back to Paris under armed guard, crowds lined the roads. They spat. They screamed. They stared in silence. Some looked at the boy with pity, others with hatred. No longer a prince in the eyes of the people, he was now the child of the enemy. And yet, through all of this, Louis Charles remained calm. Too young to understand treason, too innocent to comprehend revolution, he simply held his mother's hand and watched the world fall apart around him. In 1792, monarchy itself was abolished. The king was no longer king. The queen was no longer queen. They were prisoners, enemies of the people. Louis Charles was 7 years old. His brother, the older Dauphin, had died the year before from tuberculosis. Suddenly, the spare had become the heir. To royalists, scattered in exile across Europe, Louis Charles was now the rightful king, Louis XVII. But he was not in a palace. He was in a cell. The boy born to rule found himself in chains. The boy crowned in name found himself surrounded by guards who mocked him, beat him, and called him wolf cub. He was born into a kingdom on fire, and it would burn him too. The winds of revolution do not arrive as a storm all at once. They rise slowly, through whispers in crowded taverns, through pamphlets passed from hand to hand, through empty markets and hungry bellies. By 1789, those whispers had become a roar. France was on the brink of collapse. A monarchy that once claimed divine right now faced human consequences. While Louis XVI fretted over reforms and debts, while Marie Antoinette ordered new silk gowns from Vienna, the people were dying. Not figuratively, literally. They starved, they froze. They watched their children grow skeletal while the palace at Versailles burned more firewood in one day than they could gather in a month. But the suffering was not merely physical. It was moral. It was spiritual. The people no longer believed in the monarchy, not in its sanctity, nor its mercy, nor its purpose. And so, when the king convened the Estates General in May 1789, hoping to prevent civil war by asking for advice from France's three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, he unknowingly opened the door to the very thing he feared. What emerged was not dialogue, it was defiance. The Third Estate, which represented nearly 98% of the population, walked out of the ceremonial hall and declared themselves the National Assembly, the true voice of France. The king tried to dismiss them. They refused to disband. Soon after, they took the tennis court oath, swearing never to separate until France had a constitution. At Versailles, the nobility scoffed. At the Palais Royal in Paris, the common people cheered. Revolution was no longer an idea. It was now a promise. Fear spread like smoke through the aristocracy. The royal family watched from the gilded windows of Versailles as the world they knew began to break apart. The queen grew silent. The king grew indecisive. And outside the palace walls, Paris grew louder. In July 1789, rumors exploded across the city. The king was sending troops to dissolve the National Assembly. Royal soldiers were on the march. The people had to act. And on July 14th, they did. A mob of artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, and revolutionaries stormed an ancient fortress in the heart of Paris, the Bastille. It was more than a prison. It was a symbol of royal tyranny, a place where once kings had thrown enemies into dungeons without trials, without questions, without names. Now it would fall by the hands of the people. The siege was bloody. Soldiers opened fire. Dozens died. But the crowd overwhelmed them. The governor of the Bastille was dragged into the streets, stabbed, and beheaded. His head was placed on a pike and paraded through the alleys. Paris celebrated. Versailles trembled. The storming of the Bastille sent a shockwave through Europe. In salons and courts, kings and queens watched with fear. But in France, peasants began to rise in villages across the country. Manor houses were burned, feudal documents destroyed, aristocrats fled. The Great Fear had begun. At Versailles, the monarchy still clung to formality. Louis XVI, now panicked but slow to act, officially recognized the National Assembly. He hoped this would calm the tide. It didn't. On October 5th, 1789, a new force arrived, the women of Paris. They marched through rain and mud, armed with kitchen knives and muskets, some carrying their starving children in one hand and clubs in the other. They chanted a single word: bread. The march to Versailles was not a riot. It was a reckoning. By the time they reached the gates, their numbers had swelled into the thousands. They stormed the palace. They dragged the royal family from their beds. The queen narrowly escaped assassination. Louis XVI was forced to bow before the crowd. He and his family, including little Louis Charles, were ordered to return with them to Paris. They would never return to Versailles again. At the Tuileries Palace, they were not prisoners, not yet, but they were no longer free. Their home was now a gilded cage in the center of a city that no longer loved them. Outside the palace gates, the revolution accelerated. In 1790, the Assembly abolished feudal rights. In 1791, the king tried to flee again. The flight to Varennes was his last gamble. The royal family disguised themselves and slipped into a carriage heading for the border. They were recognized in a town called Varennes and brought back to Paris in disgrace. From that moment on, the monarchy was finished. The people no longer viewed Louis XVI as a reformer or even as a king. They saw him as a traitor. And when the First French Republic was proclaimed in 1792, it sealed the fate of everyone in the royal bloodline. Louis XVI would be tried and executed. Marie Antoinette would follow. And Louis Charles, at just 7 years old, would become the target of something more brutal than death. He would become a symbol. The revolutionaries would not simply imprison him. They would transform him into a tool, a weapon of propaganda, an object of humiliation. They would strip him of his name. They would tear him from his mother's arms. And they would place a silent, frightened boy into a cell where the echo of liberty rang louder than the cries of any child. The revolution had erupted, and it would spare no one, not even a child. The temple was once a sacred fortress, a grand medieval stronghold in the heart of Paris, its ancient stone walls echoing with the legacy of knights and kings. But for one child, it would become something else entirely. A place of disappearance, a chamber of silence. The end of childhood. On August 13, 1792, the royal family was escorted to the temple prison. The streets outside were filled with jeers and curses. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and history. The polished mirrors of Versailles were gone, replaced by iron bars, cracked walls, and narrow, suffocating corridors. Louis Charles, just 7 years old, was no longer a prince. To the revolutionaries, he was no longer even a child. He was now Louis Capet, son of the tyrant. And to some, he was the living symbol of the monarchy that had to be destroyed. The early days inside the temple were strange, suspended in uncertainty. The family lived together, Marie Antoinette, Louis XVIII, their daughter Marie-Thérèse, and the young boy, in a confined but tolerable space. They cooked simple meals, played quiet games, and clung to each other in the dim light of oil lamps. But everything changed after January 1793. Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, leaving his family shattered. Marie Antoinette never told her son the full truth, only that his father had gone away. But the silence that followed spoke louder than words. Weeks later, the boy was forcibly separated from his mother and sister. He was dragged screaming from their arms by armed guards and placed in a room alone with no explanation. It was the last time he would ever see his mother. What followed was not imprisonment, it was psychological torture. The boy was entrusted to a revolutionary cobbler named Antoine Simon, a man with no experience raising children but plenty of hatred for the crown. Under the pretense of re-education, Louis Charles was starved, neglected, and beaten. He was forced to drink, forced to curse his family, and made to sign false confessions accusing his own mother of incest. Every day, he was locked away in a tiny, dark chamber at the top of the tower. No sun, no books, no voice. His only companions were rats, shadows, and silence. Neighbors later testified they heard him crying out at night, sobbing, muttering to himself, singing lullabies alone in the dark. His clothes rotted on his body. His hair grew long and matted. His speech faltered. His memory blurred. From prince to prisoner. From child to ghost. This transformation did not go unnoticed. Even some revolutionaries began to question the cruelty of the boy's treatment. But by then, it was too late. Marie Antoinette was executed in October 1793. She died not knowing the fate of her son. And Louis Charles, locked in his high stone tomb, never even knew she was gone. He spent over 2 years in solitary confinement. When guards finally entered his cell again, they found a pale, sickly, silent boy. He could barely walk. He could barely speak. His eyes were sunken, his limbs thin and frail. He no longer answered to his name. He no longer asked for his mother. He had simply stopped being. He was 10 years old. What happened in that tower remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of child imprisonment. There were no witnesses, no diaries, no final words. Only silence. But in that silence, the image of the boy grew stronger. To royalists, he remained Louis XVII, the rightful king in exile. To revolutionaries, he was a problem to be buried. To history, he became a tragic emblem, a child swallowed by the very ideals that claimed to liberate mankind. The temple did not collapse, the boy did. And for a nation that cried liberty, equality, and fraternity, it had failed to offer him any of the three. There are wounds you cannot see, scars that do not bleed. Torture does not always come in the form of chains, blades, or fire. For Louis Charles, it came in the form of silence, of abandonment, of being turned into a ghost before his body had even finished growing. After being torn from his mother's arms, the boy was locked in isolation under the care of Antoine Simon, a former cobbler turned jailer, who now styled himself a revolutionary educator. But Simon had no intention of nurturing the child. His task was clear: break him. Louis Charles was no longer a person, he was a symbol. And to destroy the symbol of monarchy, the revolutionaries believed they had to strip it of its innocence. They began by severing his identity. He was renamed Louis Capet, after his father's executioner-assigned surname, a common insult designed to erase his royal lineage. He was forbidden from speaking of his past, of his family, or even calling his mother Mama. He was taught to spit when her name was mentioned. He was forced to wear the red bonnet of revolution, to chant slogans he didn't understand, to drink alcohol until he vomited, and to swear, constantly with the very people he once loved. Simon laughed as he taught the child filth. Guards encouraged it, visitors cheered. Louis Charles, once the bright, curious boy of Versailles, began to fade. The food was rotten. The air was damp. The walls were alive with mold and shadows. His world had shrunk to a few paces in a leaking ceiling. And then came the interrogation. Revolutionary officials ordered him to sign a confession, one that would shake all of France. In it, Louis Charles was made to claim that his mother, Marie Antoinette, had sexually abused him. He was 8 years old. They told him it was just a story, that he would be released if he did it, that he'd see his mother again. They placed ink and paper before him and waited. And so the child, filthy, starving, terrified, signed. The confession became national news. The Queen was put on trial, and when asked to respond to the charges made by her son, she said only this: "I appeal to all mothers." The courtroom went silent. But the silence in Louis Charles' cell was worse. He was not freed. He was not praised. He was forgotten. Simon eventually left. No one replaced him. For over a year, the boy remained alone. No human contact, no fresh air, no light, no comfort. His speech decayed. His memory collapsed. He began talking to himself, to the walls, to rats. He scratched shapes into the floor with broken pieces of stone. He sang lullabies with a whisper, then wept when he forgot the words. He hallucinated shadows of his sister calling his name. The walls that had once imprisoned him now absorbed him. The boy who had been called a king became something less than a prisoner. He became invisible. When guards finally returned to check on him, they found a child who no longer recognized their presence. He flinched at light. He cried at voices. His arms and legs were covered in sores. His clothes were fused to his skin. His teeth were rotting. His eyes were blank. They called a doctor too late. There was no execution for Louis Charles, no dramatic guillotine, no crowd to jeer, no final words. His death began long before his body failed. It began the day the world told him he was no longer a child. By the autumn of 1793, the Queen of France no longer lived in a palace. Her throne had been reduced to a wooden bench. Her courtiers were now guards. Her kingdom, a single stone cell. Marie Antoinette, once draped in diamonds and silk, now sat alone in silence, awaiting her execution. They called her the Widow Capet. No longer queen, no longer wife, no longer mother. Her husband was dead, her son taken, her daughter imprisoned, and she waited for the blade. After the failed escape to Varennes, after the fall of the monarchy, and after Louis XVI's execution, Marie Antoinette became a symbol of everything the revolution hated. She was foreign, she was rich, she was proud. But in truth, she was now just a woman, tired, pale, and broken by grief. Her imprisonment began in the Temple prison. But as the trial neared, she was transferred to Conciergerie, known by many as the antechamber to the guillotine. Here, in this cold, damp fortress on the Seine, she was kept under constant surveillance. Guards watched her even as she slept. She was forbidden privacy, even when dressing or bathing. She endured in silence. She had nothing left to protect. Marie Antoinette aged rapidly. Her hair turned white within months. Her once famous gowns were replaced with coarse gray wool. Her skin lost its color, her posture its poise. She spent her days alone, knitting, writing, remembering. But the worst wound wasn't physical. It was the betrayal of her son. The fabricated confession signed under duress by the little boy she had cradled, fed, protected. A document claiming she had committed incest. She never condemned him. She knew what they had done to him. And when she stood before the Revolutionary Tribunal and was asked to respond to the charge, she did not shout or deny. She said simply, "I appeal to all mothers." It was enough. The courtroom fell silent. Even hardened officials looked away, but no silence could stop the blade. On the morning of October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette awoke in darkness. She washed with cold water, combed her white hair as best she could, and dressed in a plain white shift. A priest entered her cell to offer final rites. She whispered her prayers, clutching a small crucifix. Outside the tumbril, an open wooden cart waited to carry her to the scaffold. She was tied at the hands, then forced to climb aboard, seated beside the executioner. She did not speak. She did not cry. Along the road, people screamed, spat, cursed. Some threw mud, but others quietly bowed their heads. She passed the ruins of Tuileries Palace, past markets, past those who once bowed before her. Now they stood as judges. At the foot of the guillotine, she stumbled. Her foot brushed against the executioner's boot. Instinctively, she apologized. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Those were her final words. A few moments later, the blade fell. The crowd roared. The drummers beat. The revolution marched forward. But in that instant, something else fell too. A chapter closed. A monarchy ended. A woman once worshipped, then hated, was now gone. They buried her body in an unmarked grave, her name scratched from official memory. But history remembers. Not just the queen who danced in Versailles, but the mother who whispered prayers in chains. The woman who stood alone before a nation and did not beg, did not scream, only mourned her children and walked to her death with her head held high. Louis Charles, once heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, died on June 8, 1795, in a dark, windowless prison cell. He was just 10 years old. There were no final words, no public execution, no ceremony, only the silent decay of a child whom the world had already forgotten. When guards found him, he was curled on a pile of straw, feverish and barely breathing. His limbs were frail, his face unrecognizable, his body broken. A royal son, reduced to a nameless prisoner. Doctors were summoned, but too late. The official cause of death was scrofulous tuberculosis, worsened by years of abuse, starvation, and isolation. His death certificate listed him only as Louis Charles Capet, but almost immediately questions began to surface. Was it really him? 2 years earlier, he had been taken from his family and placed in solitary confinement. During that time, no one outside the revolutionary regime had seen him. No family, no royalist visitors, no independent doctors, no witnesses, only jailers, and silence. Even the autopsy raised suspicion. The surgeons who examined the body described extensive scarring, injuries inconsistent with illness alone, deep bruises, old infections, sores left untreated. The child had clearly been tortured. But one surgeon, Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan, noticed something else. The boy's face was oddly unfamiliar, as if it didn't match the child he remembered. Pelletan, moved by guilt and doubt, secretly removed the child's heart before burial. He preserved it in alcohol and hid it away, believing that one day the truth might matter. The rest of the body was buried in a mass grave in the cemetery of Sainte Marguerite, unmarked, without any royal acknowledgement. But rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the real Louis XVII had escaped, that a loyal servant had smuggled him out, that the boy in the cell had been replaced with another child to deceive the revolutionaries. A political body double. Over the next century, more than 100 impostors would step forward, men claiming to be the lost king, miraculously rescued and raised in secret. Each had a different story, different scars, different memories. Some fooled entire communities. Some were exposed as liars. But none could prove they were the real Louis Charles. Still, the mystery refused to die. The heart stolen by Dr. Pelletan changed hands many times. It was lost, found, stolen again. And finally, in the year 2000, after 2 centuries of uncertainty, scientists were able to extract DNA from the preserved heart. They compared it to the remains of Marie Antoinette's direct relatives. A genetic line passed from mother to child. And the result was undeniable. The heart belonged to Louis XVII. The boy who had died in silence in a dark prison cell with no comfort and no name was indeed the son of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. There had been no escape, no miracle, no last-minute switch, just tragedy. But even in death, Louis Charles had been reduced to something symbolic. His name had become a myth, his pain a political tool, his innocence buried deeper than his bones. He was not remembered for who he was, but for who he might have been. The revolution had ended his life. But in the century that followed, Louis XVII refused to stay dead. or so the world believed. From the moment news of his death reached the streets of Paris, doubts began to spread. The people had not seen the body. There had been no royal funeral, no procession, no burial the public could witness. His grave was unmarked, his identity unconfirmed. And where uncertainty begins, myths take root. Over the decades that followed, more than 100 men across Europe would claim to be the lost Dauphin, each with their own tale of escape, exile, and royal destiny. Some said he had been smuggled out of the temple prison in a basket of laundry. Others claimed he had been swapped for a servant's child by a sympathetic guard. Some said he had been raised in the forest of Germany. Others in the halls of nobility under false names. Each man told his story differently, but they all claimed the same thing. I am Louis XVII. I am the rightful king of France. The most famous of these claimants was Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a German clockmaker who appeared in the 1830s. He arrived in Paris and presented himself not as a madman, but as a man of noble bearing with memories of Versailles, family details no outsider could know, and a quiet dignity that won him supporters. Even some members of the royal family believed him. Naundorff published books, testified in court, and demanded recognition from the restored Bourbon monarchy. When they refused, he fled to the Netherlands, where he lived under state protection and carried the title Prince of Bourbon. He died in 1845, but not before founding a line of descendants who still claim royal rights to this day. Other impostors were less convincing. There was Baron Rickmont, who spent years in prison for fraud. Eleazar Williams, a missionary in America who insisted he had forgotten his past until God revealed his identity. And Mathurin Bruneau, a sailor who made bold claims but was later exposed as an opportunist. And yet, even as many were proven false, public fascination only grew. Why? Because Louis XVII's death had never felt like an ending. It was too quiet, too hidden, and for monarchists desperate to believe in restoration and for revolutionaries eager to bury the past. The idea of the lost king was both a fantasy and a threat. Governments investigated, churches held quiet hearings, books were written, portraits commissioned. Every new claimant reignited the question, what if the boy survived? The debate raged for over a century. It twisted history, divided families, and in the absence of proof, imagination filled the void. Some impostors were buried as royalty, others died in asylums. A few became local legends, but none could offer what the world truly needed, evidence. That would come only centuries later when modern science would examine a hidden heart preserved in glass and match its DNA to Marie Antoinette's bloodline. But in the era before that answer, the impostors gave voice to a deep and unresolved pain. A child had been destroyed behind stone walls, and the world was desperate to believe that somewhere, somehow, he had been saved. For over 2 centuries, the mystery of Louis XVII's death remained one of Europe's most debated royal enigmas. His disappearance birthed legends, impostors, and questions that haunted France. But in the late 20th century, science finally stepped in where history had failed. In 1795, Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan, the physician who performed the autopsy on the boy believed to be Louis XVI, had secretly removed the child's heart. It was a common practice at the time for physicians to preserve organs from notable deaths. Pelletan kept the heart, believing it belonged to the son of a king. Over the decades, the heart passed through numerous hands, smuggled, hidden, even briefly lost during the Napoleonic Wars. At one point, it was placed inside a crystal jar and stored behind church walls in Paris. It became a relic of political mystery rather than biological proof. Then, in the 1990s, a team of researchers decided to resolve the mystery once and for all. The preserved heart was carefully retrieved. Scientists from several countries collaborated, including renowned geneticists from Belgium and Germany. Their task? Extract viable DNA and compare it to living royal descendants. For the comparison, they used mitochondrial DNA, a type of genetic material passed down the maternal line. They selected samples from living descendants of Marie Antoinette's lineage, particularly her sister's descendants, to avoid any contamination from paternal genes. The process was meticulous. First, a fragment of the heart tissue was shaved off and placed under intense sterilization. It was then immersed in chemical solutions to break down centuries of decay. Finally, the DNA was extracted, amplified, and sequenced. Everyone held their breath. The mystery had endured for over 200 years. Was this truly the heart of Louis XVII? Or had an innocent peasant child died in his place? The results were stunning. The mitochondrial DNA from the preserved heart perfectly matched that of Marie Antoinette's lineage. There was no doubt the heart belonged to her biological son. In a moment, centuries of rumors were crushed. The boy who died in the temple prison, neglected, starved, and psychologically broken, was indeed Louis Charles, Louis XVIII, the rightful heir to the French throne. In 2004, in a solemn ceremony, the heart was placed inside the royal necropolis at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where French kings and queens had been buried for centuries. It now rests alongside his mother and father, silent, dignified, and finally recognized. But the power of this discovery went beyond royalty. It was a reminder of how history can hide the truth beneath myth, and how science, even after centuries, can peel back the curtain. Louis XVII never ruled. He never signed a decree or wore a crown. But his heart, both literally and symbolically, became one of the most enduring puzzles of French history. And now, through the lens of DNA, the mystery was no longer a question of belief. It was a question of proof. France did not simply lose a monarch when Louis XVII died. It lost a symbol of continuity, innocence, and the illusion of order in a world turned upside down. The monarchy had long been the beating heart of France, woven into the soul of its people for centuries. Kings were more than rulers. They were sacred, chosen by God, bathed in coronation oil and cloaked in divine authority. But the revolution ripped away that illusion. When Louis XVI was executed, it shocked the world. But when his son, the delicate, voiceless Louis Charles, was thrown into darkness and left to rot in silence, it shattered something deeper. A child, born into splendor, stripped of all that made him royal, stripped of his toys, his tutors, his dignity, and finally his name. In his lonely cell, the boy became a phantom, a quiet reminder of everything France had torn down and couldn't replace. Even revolutionaries who prided themselves on justice couldn't give him one. He became a prisoner of ideology, not just of stone walls, but of rage, vengeance, and fear. And in the end, when his small, diseased body gave out, France didn't just bury a child, it buried a symbol of its past. That symbol haunted France for centuries. Every time a false dauphin rose, it was another sign the people weren't ready to forget. That somewhere, even in the hearts of revolutionaries, the old world still whispered. They didn't mourn the child alone. They mourned the kingdom that had vanished, a world of courtiers and cathedrals, of lineage and legend. Gone. What replaced it was uncertain, and remains so even now. Louis XVII became a cautionary tale, not of monarchy's strength, but of how fragile its image truly was, how it could unravel with the scream of a mob, the strike of a guillotine, or the silence of a dying child. No funeral procession carried his casket through the streets, no hymns were sung, no kingdom wept aloud. And yet, over 200 years later, people still remember. Not because he ruled, but because he didn't get the chance. Because in his short life, Louis Charles became the embodiment of everything France tried to escape, and everything it was afraid it had lost forever. The story of Louis XVII does not end with his tragic death. If anything, that's where it begins, in the minds of historians, royalists, skeptics, and even conspiracy theorists who have spent over 2 centuries trying to piece together what his life and death truly meant. He never ruled. He never spoke to his people from a throne. He never wrote royal decrees, nor led a nation. And yet, Louis Charles of France, the child who became king in name only, left behind a legacy more haunting and powerful than many crowned monarchs. His legacy lies not in power, but in pain. A pain that represents the collapse of centuries of monarchy, of dynastic continuity, of the divine right of kings. When the boy king died in captivity at just 10 years old, France did not merely bury a prince. It buried a symbol of what was and what could never be again. There is no simple resolution to his story. DNA tests confirmed that the heart preserved in crystal belonged to him. But for some, even science isn't enough. The mystery lingers because it was never just about a child. It was about identity, legitimacy, and the human cost of political upheaval. Many French people, even today, speak of Louis XVII not with historical detachment but with emotion. Some call him the lost king. Others see him as a martyr. Some even insist he never died in the temple at all. And maybe that's why this story still resonates. Because it's unfinished. The image of the young Louis Charles, pale, frightened, isolated in a damp cell, evokes something primal. The idea that a nation could turn so violently on its own child forces us to ask, what happens when revolution forgets its humanity? Was the price too high? Did liberty, equality, and fraternity demand the death of a boy? This is the question that echoes through history, and depending on who you ask, the answer changes. For some, the French Revolution was a necessary rupture, a violent but righteous break from the decadence and injustice of monarchy. In that view, the death of Louis XVII, tragic as it may be, was collateral damage in the pursuit of freedom. But others ask, when you strip a child of his family, his name, and his dignity, What is left of the humanity you claim to fight for? The monarchy may have fallen, but the question of who was truly innocent lingers. And perhaps that's the true power of Louis XVI's legacy. Not the life he lived, but the debate he ignited. A debate that continues today every time we revisit the revolution. In museums, his name is listed with a footnote. In royalist circles, he is revered. In textbooks, he is often skipped over in favor of more familiar names. And yet, when his preserved heart was finally laid to rest beside his parents in 2004, in the royal necropolis of Saint-Denis, it was not just a burial. It was a quiet, symbolic gesture of reconciliation, of remembering. And still, there are those who say the heart was a fraud, that the DNA was manipulated, that the real Louis XVII escaped. These voices may be fringe, but they exist, because the truth, once broken and politicized, is rarely whole again. Some even claim he resurfaced decades later in Germany or America. Books have been written, bones have been tested, and in the gaps left by silence, imagination has run wild. That is the ultimate tragedy, and power of Louis XVII. He became a mirror in which we see everything, monarchy and mob rule, faith and doubt, power and helplessness. He reminds us that children are the first to suffer when politics turn cruel. And in remembering him, not just as a king, but as a boy, we are forced to confront the darker corners of our own history. He was not crowned in glory, but in grief. He was not buried with honor, but in anonymity. But in telling his story, we reclaim something essential. The truth that every child, even one born into power, deserves to live free from cruelty. Perhaps that's the legacy Louis XVII leaves behind. Not a crown, not a throne, but a question, a challenge, and a wound that history still struggles to heal.